I'm physically and sexually attracted to women, that's definitely not compatible with the faith I'd grown up with. I thought I was surrendering my future in terms of like, I think I'm gonna be alone for the rest of my life. Lord, would you just heal me? And I remember in January thinking, okay, you're not gonna heal me, so I might as well go and be with you. And I get into the psych ward, and it's a locked unit because they have to make sure you're safe to yourself and people around you before they let you out. So it's like literally like solitary confinement.
What would you say was the bigger aspect of suffering in your life? Was it the dealing with same-sex attraction, or would you say it was the mental health bipolar aspect?
My heart just pounded the whole night. I was so prepared for him to out me to my parents and to say, like, this is
Ruslan.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have an amazing in-studio guest. Brena Blaine is an author, a theologian, a wife, a mom, and she's awesome. I am so grateful for her to be with us. She's based in Portland. Brand new book that just launched, and I'm so excited to be talking to you, Brena. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to have you here. So we met at Preston Sprinkle's Theology in the Raw, which is absolutely going to get me in trouble for referencing that conference. But we're just going to dive into the deep stuff, and then I want to kind of work our way back to some of your story, if that's okay. So at the Theology in the Raw conference just a couple weeks ago, which got a lot of pushback from a lot of different people, you shared on a back-to-back presentation of people who have dealt with same-sex attraction, and then there was like a panel you guys did afterwards.
Yeah.
And first of all, you crushed it at that. I hope Preston puts that out publicly because your talk was awesome. I asked you, like, have you done spoken word poetry before? Because it was super fire. So for people who may not be familiar with you, just give us a little bit about more of you, and then let's talk about what you talked about at Theology in the Raw, and then we'll kind of get into, I mean, you've been on a mission trip to China before. You've done some really cool stuff. So for folks who don't know who you are, who is Brena?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I get asked that, I think of like my day-to-day life, which is that I'm a stay-at-home mom. That's like my primary thing, is I'm home with my kids all the time. But then you take a step back, and the things that I get to do, I say like nights and weekends, that's when I'm a theologian. That's when I get to speak for churches and conferences, and I primarily speak on the intersection of faith and suffering, because when I look at my own life, that has been where I have lived, is between the intersection of deep suffering and then going, okay, but where is God in this? Is he even in this to begin with? And if he is, like, if God is with us in our suffering, does that still mean he's good? If he's sitting with us in our suffering instead of taking us out of our suffering, right? And so that's a passion for me, is that subject. I talk a lot about sexuality because that's also part of my story. I was diagnosed as bipolar as an adult, and realized I was gay when I was 14. And so there's a lot of things about my story that when I share with people, they go, oh yeah, and then they find out that I'm still a Christian. And I think that's usually the interest part for people, is going like, wait a second. How can you go through all these things, experience these things, do some deconstruction, and then why do you still believe the Bible? Why do you still believe that God is good? And so that's the space that I've found myself in, primarily because I love the people who are spiritually suspicious.
I like that phrase, spiritually suspicious.
Those are the people that I find that the evangelical church has kind of turned their back on them. The people who are on the edges and the boundary lines of church, where they're like they're close enough because they want to hear what's going on, but they maybe don't feel invited in to the building, or they don't feel like they're clean enough to get in, or they feel like their baggage is too much so that they can't get it through the door. Or maybe they were inside the church and they experienced something and they had to get out of there. Those are the people that I feel most at home with, I
Interesting.
think.
Yeah. So you mentioned that at 14 you discovered you were gay. That's what your talk was at Theology in the Realm. At the same time, you also just said that you're a stay-at-home mom, your wife. How does all of that work? And I want to kind of go a little deeper on the gay Christian aspect because that's very controversial language. And it's received a lot of backlash, whether it's just backlash towards the idea of side B. I don't know if you identify as that. So how does all that work? I want to get to the bipolar thing, but like you say, discovered you were gay at 14, but now you're married with kids to someone that is, your husband is the opposite gender, right? So like, help us understand.
Yeah, so my dad was actually a pastor growing up, and I knew the list, what I thought was the laundry list of what it meant to be a Christian, right? These are the things you do, these are the things you don't do. And I think that's a lot of young people's perception of faith, is that you tick off the boxes and that's what works. And I think that does work for people who are young in their faith for a while. And then for me, it was like brokenness just crashed into my life. My grandma, who's the first person who ever talked to me about Jesus as if he was a real person that she physically walked with. She got diagnosed with cancer, and I remember like praying, going in my head as a 7-year-old, like, you pray for healing and God heals. And then I came home from camp and she had died. And for me, it was like, wait a second, this was not what I was told my entire life. And so wrestling with that. And then my parents sat us down and said, hey, like, things aren't working out. Your dad's going to move out. And watching Christians say that marriage is for life, and then seeing my parents get separated. And a month after that, I ended up being molested. And
you said your dad was a pastor.
Yeah.
So your dad's a pastor actively in ministry?
Not at this point
Not
in
at this
time.
point.
Not
Okay.
at this point in time.
Oh my goodness.
So he had left ministry, and then they got separated. And so I'm sitting there now I'm 10 going, wait a second, people say God is with you, God cares for you, God loves you. But he wasn't there for me. And he didn't heal, and he's not here for me now. And the people in my life who I thought were safe are not safe. I can't trust these people in my life. And so what else is there to be discovered that I've just believed that's not actually true? And so I have to acknowledge, I don't believe being sexually abused made me gay. I don't believe that. But I do have to acknowledge that it definitely played into, I went from being able to have like trustful relationships with men to not being able to even sit on a couch next to a man. And so I think that definitely had an impact. I didn't have the words to tell my parents that I had been abused. My parents ended up staying married and have a beautiful story of redemption. But I was not privy to that because I was so caught up in what I was experiencing. And by the time I was 14, I realized, like, I finally had the language to go, oh, I'm physically and sexually attracted to women. That's definitely not compatible with the faith I'd grown up with. So while I was thinking this whole time, like, maybe I believe, maybe I don't believe, I don't really know. As soon as I figured out I was gay, I was like, as soon as I graduate high school, I'm out of here. Like, there's no way. I'm not going to be a Christian anymore. I'm not going to hang out here. Like, I can't do this.
In the onslaught of the sexual abuse and grandmother passing away, parents are hitting a rough patch in their marriage. Are you believing that there is no God? Are you believing that the God of the Bible is not real? What would you say? Because I went through something similar. I'm not sure how much of my story you know. Mother and father, we came as refugees. Mother and father split 6 months after being out here. My mom cheated on my dad. My dad cheated on my mom. Long story short, the Armenian Apostolic Church remarried my dad to my stepmom now. So my mom developed a lot of resentment. In that same church, there were some older altar boys. I was an altar boy at like 7 that ended up, so I was like 7, 8. They were like 13, 14, 15. They ended up sexually assaulting me. So by the time I'm 10, 4th grade, 5th grade, I'm full on like selling, smoking weed, breaking into houses. I got arrested at 11. And I'm like, there is no God. And if there is a God, he definitely doesn't like me. Like a very, like calling myself an atheist in 4th and 5th grade.
Okay.
So I'm curious for you, like experiencing something similar, right? Family, broken, sexual assault, losing a close grandmother, right? What was your view of God at that point? There is no God. I'm atheist. There is a God, but he doesn't like me very much, or any God but the Christian God.
I think I couldn't comprehend being alive and there not being a God.
Okay.
Like that just like was not a concept I could sit with, because there was created order. Like I think I recognized that, but it was maybe more of a belief in that God created and then he left and he took off, and it was
so more like a deism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And very similar to what you would say, like my walking through life, like with my parents was like, right? It's like, you're here and then things got messed up and my dad moved out. And so anytime people are like, oh, God is a father. Well, how do you tell a 10-year-old that God is your father when your earthly father has had struggles of his own? A 10-year-old can't disentangle that, right? And so I think I would even then I would be like, I'm a Christian, and I don't know that I would say, like, I mean, church, it was such this is where I have a hard time with trying to figure out how you do children's ministry. Because I was fed such a VeggieTales character of God. Whereas like God, I was so distraught over the fact that God cared more about me lying to my parents about cleaning my room or eating something I wasn't supposed to eat than he cared about my abuse. But it's like people think you can't talk to 10-year-olds about abuse. Well, statistics say kids are being abused by the time, I think it's like by the time they're 7. It's like 1 in 3 girls or 1 in 4 girls. So if we're not talking about it, it's still happening. And then it's creating this, it's giving a picture of God that is so false.
Yeah. I'm taking my son through the book of Genesis right now, verse by verse. And him asking, like, I want to go deeper, because I think he's kind of getting some of that VeggieTales surface thing, right? And so going through that, the interesting part is in the book of Genesis, there all of that is there. And so we've been having the biology conversation for a while. Boys got sperms, mommies have eggs. Even, but about a year ago, we got into the pleasure aspect of what sex is. And so now on the other side of that, we're going through Genesis, and you're just seeing all these patriarchs of the faith that are just broken and just blowing it in this whole thing. And oddly enough, there was one, I was telling my wife, I'm like, I'm just going to take him through it. Like, we're just going to go and we're just going to study it. And she's like, I don't know. Like, he's 9. I don't know. And I'm like, listen, I'd rather him get it from me and the Bible than like from the world or one of his friends or something. But there is one chapter in Genesis that we came across that it's the chapter where one of the sisters of the 12 sons of Israel gets raped. And then the brothers go and take vengeance out on the village. They have them get circumcised as a covenant, and then they wait until they're healing, and it says they go out and they just destroy this entire village. And that was the one chapter I was like, oh man, I don't think I can, like, we've talked about sex, we've talked about false accusations with Joseph, we've talked about Abraham lying repeatedly, and then that pattern repeating about, she was a sister, not his wife, like Lot getting drunk, like we've talked about all these things. But like, I don't know if I could go and like look at this gnarly chapter about a woman getting raped. And that was the one chapter I skipped in Genesis. And hearing you say that, I'm kind of like, we've talked about like private parts, and those are for you, and don't let, like, rather there's a conversation. But it's interesting that you point all of that out, like the VeggieTales aspect, and then the reality of what the Bible actually says, and the character of God and justice and all that kind of stuff in your situation. So I think the reason why I held such resentment towards the church is because these were boys that I met through the church. And when the church kind of found out about it, they didn't really do anything. And then that just kind of made me more angry because I didn't know much, but I knew what happened wasn't right. I didn't quite fully process it all, but I knew it wasn't right. And then that led me down this like really gnarly rebellion streak. My father wasn't there. In your situation, I'm guessing it was like a family friend, or who was it? And did you ever deal with it? Like, was there ever any sort of justice towards that?
It was actually basically a stranger. I played youth sports, and I thought I'm like somewhat tall, and so I thought I'd end up in the WNBA. Like that was like my dream when I was a kid. And the third year I went in, and it was a new coach, and someone else was supposed to pick me up from practice, and they didn't show up. So I was alone with this guy, and never said a word out loud about it until I think I was, in therapy. I had just had my son and was experiencing so much PTSD from the birthing process of abuse. And so walking through that has been slow and hard, but also so, in such a strange way, there's been a gift in it, in that I think I've found my footing in ministry, because I've always wondered like where I belong in the ministry world. Me ending up in ministry is never ever what I think you ask anyone who watched me grow up, and this would not be the path that people would have put me on. And I think this passion point of this happened, and God didn't cause it to happen, but because God is good and is redeeming creation, how does he work through our brokenness and use it? As
I got older, I got diagnosed with PTSD, onset PTSD, and it made so much sense, like in therapy, and the same kind of conclusions, like God didn't cause this to happen, but he still used it for good. And in a weird way, like going through it contributed to who I am, the good and the bad. And so it is an interesting piece you end up having with how life unfolds, right? The trippy part is now my son is the age I was when this stuff happened to me. And then you just go, man, I want to protect him. I want to guard him. I want to create boundaries for him, even like stuff like sleepovers, like we're not super comfortable with, and we have a fairly tight-knit community of folks I've known since high school, like people that are in our lives and our kids play together. So it's an interesting dichotomy, but it sounds like in your case, that was the root of your distrust for men. And you said you wouldn't say that is why you are same-sex attracted, but it definitely contributed to the degree of perhaps not desire for women, but anti-desire for men. How did the rest of that play out for you?
Yeah. So I'm 14. I finally have the words to figure it out. My parents are back together at this point, and I just started having small conversations with friends. I actually grew up in musical theater. That was my one outlet, and so I had a lot of friends who were gay, and so I started having conversations like, "Hey, when did you know you were ready to come out to your parents? What did that look like? How did you come out to your friends?" Kind of having small conversations with friends in faith circles. And it was really interesting to walk through those conversations, because I think the worst conversation I had was, you're going to hell, right? But it was a friend who it was funny, that conversation, I was like, yeah, I know I'm going to hell. Like, we were both like, this sucks that this is my reality, but there's that. And then I had a lot of friends who were like, I want you to be happy. That's the most important thing, is that you're happy. And so if this is going to make you happy, then go for it.
That's what, hell or happy.
Right?
Hell or self-actualization.
Yeah.
Like, that's a trip that those were the two fringes you heard.
Yeah.
That there's nothing else in between.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I grew up in the era that the Westboro Baptist Church was the loudest voice speaking about sexuality in faith circles.
Mm.
And so it was no wonder that that was my friend's reaction, because that's all we knew. And so for me, it was like I prayed probably my first 2 years of high school every single night. Lord, would you just make me straight? If you're real, if you care about me, if you want me to be saved, which I think you do, because this is like what all of Christian faith is about, I have to be made straight. And that never changed for me. My attractions never changed. And so all of a sudden when I'm, a sophomore, at the end of my sophomore year, I'm going, well, I guess I just lean into this. Because if I'm going to go to hell, if I'm going to spend eternity in hell, I might as well be happy while I'm on earth. In the meanwhile, I never came out to my parents. I had a Tumblr, and I thought I was super sneaky, but it was so obvious if you went onto my Tumblr that I was gay. It was just so obvious. And a dude from my church found it. And I was going to this youth group that every time I was there, I was like, I don't believe in this stuff. Like, I don't think God is good. I don't think he really cares about us. But the community there was very, it was just like a me community. Everyone there was in like a garage band or listened to alt music and thrifted. And it was very like that era. And I felt like I finally belonged someplace. And this guy found my Tumblr and sent the link to my small group leader, and she was like, messaged me one day, Brena, like, what's going on? And I think I denied it pretty hard. I think the final thing I had said to her was like, well, I'm not gonna act on it because I'm a Christian, like just totally BSing it. And then a few weeks later, she was like, hey, she was 18, so she also was just trying to do her best, but she was like, I don't know what to do. So I told John, who's my youth pastor, and every story I had heard up until that point was my pastor found out I was gay, I got kicked out of the church. So I was really holding my breath. Like I was kind of like, oh, my life might be over. Like I might need to maybe kill myself now. I don't know.
Whoa.
I was already in that place.
Yeah.
I was self-harming. I think by that point I had been on 4 different medications for depression, was never really sleeping. I was just a mess. And, was just like, can I go to youth group and get away with it? It was a pretty big youth group. So I went thinking I could avoid John, and that was so wrong. And that's when you're like, your frontal lobe was so not developed, thinking you could go to youth group and avoid your pastor. And he just said, hey, Brena, can I talk to you later? And my heart just pounded the whole night. I was so prepared for him to out me to my parents and to say, like, this is what we believe theologically, and you can't be here anymore until you change, or this, that, the other thing. We end up sitting down together, and he looks at me and goes, Brena, I just need you to know that a lot of Christians wrestle with same-sex attraction, and I'm really glad you're here. And that was it. And he got up and left. And to me, that was insane to experience, because...
Wait, that's literally all he said?
That's all he said.
There was no, like, you didn't get to respond? It was just that sentence. And
I think he knew that I didn't really have anything to say.
Do you think he knew that you really didn't want to have the conversation as
yeah.
well?
Oh,
okay.
For sure.
So it was just kind of like, hey, you're here, you're loved.
Yes.
And, like, when you're ready to talk, we can talk.
Yeah.
I'm going to go. Energy.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
So it was so strange to sit with that, because he didn't out me to my parents, but he didn't. It was so interesting, whereas like all these responses previously had been, we just want you to be happy. All of a sudden, it was like he left me in the tension to wrestle with. He didn't tell me it was wrong, but also like he didn't infer otherwise. And so all of a sudden it was like, okay, maybe I'm living a life contrary to what the church believes, but also I'm still allowed to be here. So what does that mean? So I continued going to youth group, and I ended up hearing a sermon that I would have never heard if I didn't go.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy, he got up on stage, and I was like, what is this dude doing? It was like, is being gay a sin? That was the topic that night. And I'm like, we all know the answer. It's yes.
Mm-hmm.
And he got up, and I'm like, this dude's a straight dude. He's married. He has 4 kids. Like, why is he talking? And he said, I always thought the minute that I married my wife, my attraction to all other women would just disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized after we got married, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But because I have the Holy Spirit, I get to be dependent on him to help me when I'm struggling with my temptations. And he's like, it's so sad that we so readily believe that for heterosexual people, but we don't believe that for homosexual people.
Mm-hmm.
We say you have to be straight or you're going to hell. But there's no nuance of that, when in reality, like, that's not what's true. And it wasn't until later I heard Jackie Hill Perry rephrase that and saying it's not about being straight, it's about being holy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think at that point it was maybe 16. So as a 16-year-old, all of a sudden Christianity was an option again because it wasn't about being made straight.
Wow.
So if I ever came to the conclusion that I did want to serve this God, I wouldn't have to wait around for my attractions to change. I could step into that relationship with Christ while still wrestling with same-sex attraction and trust the Holy Spirit. Now, that was not the choice I made at the time. I was still on that trajectory of, no, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to become an atheist. I'm going to go smoke a ton of weed and surf and do whatever I want to do and be a lesbian, and that's great. But it was like that sermon lived in the back of my brain literally for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I think that's a great parallel, because I think when having the conversation about side B, side A, which is just, for folks who don't know the label, side A is like you just are gay and practice a gay lifestyle. Side B is you identify that you have same-sex desires, but you are celibate.
Mm-hmm.
Side X is you are like, you're no longer gay. You were once gay, now you're no longer gay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that side X? And then what is side Y? I always get confused about
Side Y, I don't want to claim that I'm saying this perfectly, so if there's someone in the comments who better understands side Y, go ahead. But it would be, in what I understand it to be, is you work at changing your attractions until they change, and it's not something you want to identify with.
So side Y is kind of like a bridge between side B and side X. Sounds like, yeah. So you work towards that, but you just don't identify. It sounds like, yeah. You just don't identify as that. Okay, so people have thought that like the only historical position that's like okay is side X. Like, I was gay. I'm no longer gay no more. Right? That meme. Yeah. And the parallel to men who many men are attracted to multiple women throughout the course of their lifetime, I think is one that isn't extended in good faith to folks who are same-sex attracted. Because now we have to get into, well, what do you mean by attracted? What do you mean by desire? Does desire always equal lust? Are you saying that, right? Because a man can be attracted to multiple women. The moment it becomes a sin is when you start lusting after multiple women. But generally speaking, if you're a dude going through life and you're married, you're still going to find other women attractive. But that doesn't mean you have to lust after them or pursue them in unhealthy, sinful ways. So I always found it interesting that same charity isn't extended to people who are same-sex attracted. And then when hearing you guys do your talk at Theology in the Raw, like, you guys clarified the panel specifically. I think you guys were like, who was it that said, like, I'm not sitting here attracted to all these dudes, right? Like, I have this now. And sometimes who was it that said that sometimes it even goes away? Like, it goes away for a window of time and then it can come back. And so I found that very interesting. And and you tell me what you think about this, but I think this becomes an issue of semantics. Yeah. and what do words mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because if someone goes through the 12 steps and they choose to continue identifying as an alcoholic or an addict, like I may be like, I wouldn't use those words to describe myself. I've dealt with addictions before, with food, with porn. I wouldn't continue saying, hey guys, I'm Ruslan, and I'm an addict. I wouldn't use that language to describe myself. But I wouldn't excommunicate disfellowship, call someone dangerous, call someone a heretic, call someone a false teacher if they continue to use that sort of language to identify as an alcoholic, as an addict. Yet with this conversation, there's these hard lines drawn. So my first question to you is, do you think that that's am I using a fair parallel in terms of someone that goes through 12 steps and they still identify themselves as an addict, as a alcoholic, versus someone that gets sober and goes, you know what? No, like I refuse to say that those words over myself, right? And so question one is like, do you think that's a fair parallel?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that then the response is unwarranted in terms of the hard lines that are drawn? Because again, people in that community would never say, you're an idiot, how dare you identify as an alcoholic even though you've been sober for 25 years, heresy, you're going to hell, or whatever, you're dangerous, you're right. Like, why do you think there's this? Because it sounds like the practice is the same. You're living as a heterosexual woman, right? So the outcomes are the same. The outcome is we're going to submit our sexuality, we're going to submit our bodies, we're going to submit our passions, we're going to submit it to the ways of God, but we're now getting into the language of it, right? Like, why do you think that there's such a stark contrast in terms of how these things are being dealt with?
I think there's a really interesting culture these days of trying to make our own personal convictions biblical convictions. I think the biblical conviction here is the sexuality piece, right? Like, we are called to surrender. Every single person is called to surrender their sexuality to Jesus if they are a follower of Christ. That means sex is for one man, one woman, married for life. That's it. Anything outside of that is against what God has called good. And so that's what we hold as the biblical conviction. Now, the personal conviction would be, if I experience something outside of that, and am I called to share that with the community that I'm in? In terms of, like, do I share my struggle? Am I honest with my struggle? Am I honest with, my mentor and my pastor? Am I honest with my community group? Am I honest with the church? Am I honest on a platform? Like, what does that look like? And I think again, it's like, it's kind of like when you meet someone and they're like, Christians shouldn't drink at all. And you're like, whoa, dude, like, the Bible, there's actually room for Christians to partake in drinking. Is it supposed to be responsible? Yes. Like, there's a mandate. There are clear instructions for how we are to partake with alcohol. But there's people who are personally convicted by Christ. That's like one of my things. I haven't drank in 6 years. That's a personal conviction. I believe it would be sinful for me to try and guilt people into feeling that same conviction, when it's like the Holy Spirit will speak to you and convict you of those things. And so I find it a really, really interesting personal conviction, but a personal conviction that I've met other people who would say, hey, just between me and you, this is something that I've also struggled with, but my personal conviction is that I don't share. And I've never felt judged by those people or felt like, you're wrong, you're reading your convictions wrong. There are a lot of stumbling blocks to me publicly identifying as same-sex attracted, especially as someone in ministry, I think. But I feel personally convicted to share that story specifically because I never knew that a gay person could also be a Christian growing up, right? I never had that example. And so when I have friends, like I'm from the Portland area, so I don't say gay. When I'm talking personally, I'll say it, but on a platform, I say same-sex attracted because in the Portland area, when you say gay, people think that means one thing and one thing only. When there's much more nuance. And so when I say same-sex attracted, usually people go, oh, like that's interesting language. What do you mean by that? But when I have friends who say I'm a gay Christian, and when they say that, it becomes a reality for some young kid who's been struggling, who is deeply depressed, for them to hear, wait a second, I can be in right relationship with God while still struggling with my attractions. That's huge.
Yeah.
And so I think if we were to take our own personal convictions and place them on every single person, then we all have the same story, and there's no diversity in the body of Christ at that point. And if we all have the same one hopeful story, well, then there's not hope in these other areas, if that makes sense.
So you do not prefer the title gay Christian. Am I tracking correctly?
I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I think even in my book, I write about being gay. But for me, I try to use that on much more personal terms. So like I would never put in a bio gay Christian, because I have a conviction about what's the first information that people hear about me.
Right. If gay is preceding Christian, just in a regular sense, it can come off as incomplete in a way.
Sure. I again, like, I don't have a problem with any of my friends who identify that way.
Yep.
I just think personally for me, that's not something, well, I'll be honest. I think maybe this is maybe a conversation that isn't being had a lot. I think even in the same-sex attracted gay celibate Christian community, that title can become a little bit of an idol. Because when you say I'm a gay Christian, or when you say I'm same-sex attracted, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm getting invited to be on podcasts. I'm getting invited to write books. Like there can be a different type of adultery taking place because of that title. And so when I sit and go, okay, God, what have you called me to be in this public world? I don't personally feel convicted that God has called that to be my label.
Got it. So without having you speak on behalf of an entire community of gay, celibate, Christian, same-sex, whatever. So when you say you deal with same-sex attraction, I think that's kind of like the words you're using. What do you mean by that specifically?
So if I was not a Christian, I would only date women, and I would only be in relationships with women. I've only ever been, besides my husband, sexually, physically attracted to women. That's my experience. Now, I have to say this because I always get the question. People are like, wow, you just fake it with your husband? I would never, ever say to someone who's same-sex attracted, just like force yourself. Or you should definitely get married or be in a relationship with someone, even if the attractions aren't there. When I met Austin, we started writing letters to each other. We were both missionaries at different points in time. So we were like ships passing in the night. And I had my entire life had always had a desire to have a family. And so when I kind of realized I was gay, and then all of a sudden realized I wanted to surrender my life to Christ, I thought I was surrendering my future in terms of like, I think I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. I don't think I'm going to have kids. Because while sex isn't everything, it is a decent, important part of marriage. And so I just knew that I couldn't marry someone that I wasn't physically attracted to. So Austin and I became very good friends. We started writing to each other, and I found myself having conversations with the Lord that were like, I love him so much. If I could choose anyone to be a father to my kids, it would be this guy. If I could choose anyone to do ministry with the rest of my life with, it would be this guy. but Lord, like, if you are leading me towards this path of marriage, you have to change something, because I'm physically not attracted to him, and I can't will myself to do this, and I don't think it would be fair to enter into a marriage. And I just remember slowly over time, I remember the first time where I was like at this park, and Austin showed up, and I was like, is this what it's like to have butterflies in your stomach when you see someone for the first time that you're like.
And how long have y'all been hanging out at that point?
So I met Austin when I was a freshman, but we started hanging out when I graduated high school, moved away, did Youth with a Mission, and that's actually where I say, like, I became a Christian. I surrendered my life to Jesus. We started writing to each other during that period of time. He saw my address, remembered that I was some random girl from church, and thought, hey, missionaries need encouragement, and he started writing to me. So we really became... We were like pen pals before.
So just letters, no talking, no texting, strictly letters for a
letters
while.
And emails.
And emails,
yeah.
Okay. And then the first time you guys hang out at this park is when you feel these butterflies, and you go, is this what it's like?
Yeah, it was the summer between, so we'd been talking for a year, and I knew he was gonna leave for 6 months, and he showed up at this park, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is weird.
And was that your first time ever feeling that for a man?
Yeah. Yes. It
What
was very strange. I had dated some guy friends in high school just to keep up appearances and like try to will myself towards that. And I now as an adult, I was like, that should have been a red flag. I could never eat when I was on dates because I was so physically sick.
Interesting.
And I remember like being like, I could eat around this guy.
So in that moment, what do you think is happening? Like, is God rewiring aspects of you? Is God giving you a heart for a person you were emotionally connected with? Like, what is happening? And I'm asking you what's happening, because what I don't want to do is say this is going to happen for all same-sex attracted people, because that wouldn't be fair. But what is happening to you in that situation?
I think God was changing my heart towards Austin specifically, because it wasn't like, I wasn't like, wow, every single man now is so attractive to me. It was just Austin specifically. And so I remember like very cautiously, it was like driving so slow going, okay, Lord, I feel this. Is this right? Am I discerning this right? If so, like, would you continue to allow me to feel this? And so then he moved. So we ended up having another 6 months of just writing letters. We talked on the phone a lot this second time. And I remember he was going to Nepal. And so the day before he left, he told me like, hey, the likelihood of me being able to talk to you, because they were leaving their phones in the States, it was like they would maybe have internet like every 3 weeks to a month. And I was walking through Walmart, and I stopped in the middle of the aisle and just started sobbing. And that's when I realized like that I was in love with him, because I was just so like, I realized how deeply I was about to miss him. And that's when I knew like, oh, this is the Lord, like that things have changed. And I think when Austin gets home, if he wants to date me, I could say yes in good conscience.
Yeah. Now, how much does Austin know about where you're at this point? Does he know you have same-sex desires? Like, where is he at with your journey, and how tapped in is he?
Yeah. So at that point, I still wasn't publicly out to anyone. I hadn't shared my story. I remember the first time I shared that part of my life, I was like with a small group of girls, and I felt convicted. I felt like the Lord put it on my heart to share. And so Austin didn't know. I told him maybe about 2 months into dating, and he was so gracious and kind. And I remember him saying like, thanks for sharing that with me. That's not a small thing to share. And I kind of shared about my abuse, and he just listened. It was never... I think sometimes when you share stuff like that, there can be some like accusations that come up, or like, hey, why didn't you share this with me earlier? Or some insecurity, right? And for him, that just never came out. His character has always been deeply patient. And so he ended up walking with me when I was going, dude, I'm sensing that the Lord is asking me to share this with more people. Like, that kind of freaks me out. My parents didn't even know at that point in time.
Okay.
I mean, when I ended up coming out to my mom, I know that both of my parents were like, there were some signs when you were in high school, but we never wanted to name it for you. We wanted to give you time. And so.
Wow. So how long do you guys date? And then how long do you guys get married? And like, what was life like after that? Because you're now in this relationship, we call it a relationship with Austin, but you're also being vulnerable about this aspect of your life, which sounds like is a utility, not in a utilitarian sense, sounds like a tool to encourage other people that may be dealing with what you're dealing with. And like, how does all that unfold? And then how long until you guys get married? And now you guys have this beautiful family. And tell me about more about that.
So I think we dated for a year before we got engaged. And at that point in time, my conversations were just about my sexuality, were just ones that were one-on-one when I felt like the Holy Spirit was pushing me to share. And I never, ever thought that would turn into anything else whatsoever. Austin and I get married. I remember my youth pastor. I ended up working with him just for a really short stint of time. And he said, I think one day the Lord is going to call you to share more and with more people. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm praying for you and praying for discernment. And I had shared with a small group of girls, like I said earlier, and I think one of them shared with their brother, who had like a small video kind of vlog platform. And in 2019, I remember him asking, hey, would you come do an interview on this? Because not a lot of people are talking about it. And I remember saying yes and being really nervous because it was the first time that my community would be hearing it. It was like one of those things where you're like, I feel bad that maybe like there's people in my life who feel like I should have told them earlier, but at the same time, like, you're not going to go and sit down with every single person that you've ever known and like share this. And the video got picked up and circulated more online than I ever anticipated it to. And just kind of remembering at that point, I was in my senior year at university studying theology and biblical studies because I felt like God was calling me to teach, but I want to be equipped. That's all I knew. I didn't know anything else outside of that. And just going, oh, this is a really weird path that I did not anticipate being on. But also, okay, Lord, like, I trust you. I trust that there's a purpose to this. I trust that the attention that this is getting, that you have a plan with it. And already I had seen in the comments of like how strange that is to say, but in the comments of people going like, I've never heard this nuance before. Thank you for articulating this, because now I have hope for this specific person in my life.
Wow. So how long until you guys have kids, like get married, have kids? What was that timeline like?
Yeah,
and what did that do to you?
Yeah, we got married, and like I said, I had always wanted to be a mom, and Austin and I were like, let's wait 5 years. Well, when I got married in the middle of a medically induced manic episode. I had no idea. All I knew.
Wait, medically induced manic. Meaning you took something and it caused a manic episode? Whoa.
So I was on an SSRI. I had been on antidepressants since I was 14. But all of a sudden, this new season of life. So it started in September, like deep anxiety. And I got married in November. I went back to school in January. January 17th, I ended up in the psych ward for suicide.
Whoa.
So I'm like in this period of life where I'm not sleeping. I'm thinking about death all the time. I'm also an interim youth pastor at this point. So I'm preaching on Wednesdays, going literally, I believe this. I believe what I'm preaching. It's not false. I'm not putting on a face, but Lord, I need you to heal me because my brain is so obsessed with the thought of death. I cannot escape this. And just there'd been like some conversations with my therapist and my doctor. Maybe you're bipolar. I don't know. And the wait list to see a psychiatrist was so long. It was like 6 months. And it just felt so hopeless. Because again, I'd been praying every single day, Lord, would you just heal me? I believe you're real. I believe you see me. I believe you're with me. Would you, well, I did not believe God was with me. I believed he was outside of that at that point in time. Lord, would you just heal me? And I remember in January thinking, okay, you're not going to heal me, so I might as well go and be with you. And so I planned an attempt, and it was a Monday, and I was in the office at work, and I remember I was like, my plan was to say that I was praying about stepping down, and then I'd be dismissed from my meetings from the rest of the day, so I'd be able to go home, attempt, and if the attempt wasn't successful right away, it'd give me enough time to die before my husband got home.
Oh my gosh.
And so I go to this meeting, I say, hey, I'm praying about stepping down. I go to my office, and my door swings open, and my friend's mom walks in. And she looks at me and goes, do I need to take you to the hospital?
So she knew.
She knew. And I was like, no, I'm fine.
Was it the Lord, or how did she know? She just knew your disposition, or was it something she was getting into spiritual?
So she knew I'd been struggling for a while. She was at coffee with someone, driving home, felt like the Lord asked her to pull over and pray for me. She pulled over, prayed for me. While she's praying for me, she heard the Holy Spirit say, go get her.
Whoa.
So she drove. She showed up at my work. And the second time she asked, I just like broke down, because it was like, what if someone does know how to help me? And so she took me to her house, fed me lunch, took me to the hospital. That whole day was so wild of just, you have to tell them what your plans were. And just like saying that, and then I got escorted because there wasn't a psych ward close by. So I ended up getting transferred about 2 hours north. And I thought I was going to be able to see my husband. And at this point, we had been married 2 months. I thought I was going to see him, so I didn't say goodbye to him. He was in the bathroom when they took me out. And I get into the psych ward, and it's a locked unit because they have to make sure you're safe to yourself and people around you before they let you out. So it's like literally like solitary confinement, like metal doors, walls. There's nothing in this room. There's no door to the toilet. It's like a prison toilet. They put me in there. I asked, can I see my husband? No, you can't have visitors. Okay, could I call him? No phone privileges. And we're switching shifts right now, so you're going to be alone for the next hour. So I already wanted to die. Now I can't even kill myself because there's nothing in this room to let me do that. And for the first time ever, I'm completely alone. Like my entire life, I've grown up with the existence of a phone. There's like not even a book. There's nothing in this room to distract me. And I'm just like sitting on this bed sobbing. And I just remember hearing the phrase, with prayer and supplication, make your requests known. That's all I remember. And so I said, okay, Lord, maybe you're not going to heal me, but would you just be with me? And I woke up 8 hours later, and that was the first time I had slept in 6 months.
Whoa.
Like I had been sleeping 2 hours max a night. And I remember I was so disoriented when I woke up because I hadn't slept that long and forever. And 3 weeks later, I was flipping through the Bible and got to the story of Lazarus. And I never paid attention to Mary and Martha. And I was just reading through that section, and one of the sisters runs out into the road and says, Jesus, if you would have been here, our brother wouldn't have died. And how gut-wrenching that is. And just feeling like that had been my cry, like, Lord, if you would have been here, I wouldn't have ended up feeling like I needed to take my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember like feeling like the Holy Spirit was just like, keep reading, like press in. And I'm reading and reading, and it gets to the part where it's the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. And I'm thinking, why would Jesus stop and take time to weep if he knew he was going to raise him from the dead? Like, he talks about the coming resurrection, which all believers of Christ will experience. And then he also is planning on physically resurrecting this man from the grave. So why on earth would he take time to weep if he was going to raise him? And I just remembered the Lord going, Brena, I am not a glorified superhero. I do not desire to rush in, save you from your problems, and leave. And this whole time, that's all you've been praying for, is you wanted to be healed. But not once until you ended up in the psych ward did you ask me to be with you in your suffering.
Wow.
And how this picture of Jesus weeping, like he took time to see Mary and Martha and meet them where they were at in their suffering. Not attempt to rip them out right away, but to say, I am also, like, I am a man of sorrows. I am with you. Like, I love how many times throughout the Psalms it says, even if I make my bed at the gates of hell, you are with me. Not if I make my bed at the gates of hell, you'll come rescue me. And how I'd never realized that. And so this is the longest way to answer that question, but I got out of the hospital and just went like, I don't know why I'd want to wait 5 years to have kids. And I know my parents were so concerned. They're like, you just got diagnosed as bipolar. Or because I called them, I was like, I'm pregnant. And just thinking like, no, I don't want to wait. This is a desire I've had. And so our joke is, we've been married. It will be 7 years this fall. That our first 7 years have been the hardest 7 years. Because we've been through everything together. I've been in the psych ward twice now as an adult, in my marriage. And it never gets easier. But the grace of God becomes more potent the more that I've struggled.
You said it was a medically induced manic episode. So are you saying, because I've heard mixed things about SSRIs, like I heard there's certain people who they really treat and they help, and I've also heard that they could actually do more harm than good for other people. So was it the medication that caused a manic episode, or like help me understand that?
Yeah, so the theory is, from all the doctors that I've talked with, was that because I am actually bipolar and not depressed, or whatever the medical term for that is, the SSRI I was on at the time is worse for a bipolar person to take than the correct medication. So now I'm on mood stabilizers, and those have worked wonderfully for me, and I'm a huge believer in appropriate medication.
So the SSRIs caused an up of mania, basically.
Yeah.
And what was that like? What was that like for you?
Well, for me, it was absolutely losing the ability to sleep, which just made everything worse. And really obsessive compulsive thoughts about death all the time. And then that just spirals, because even if you're not mentally ill, you don't sleep for 3 days, you're having a rough time. You don't sleep for 6 months,
You hadn't slept in 6 months.
It had ended up being almost a total of 6 months that I was getting 2 hours of sleep a night. Just absolutely insane.
When you got the diagnosis of the bipolar, I mean, you're an adult at this point.
Yeah.
How did that feel? Were you like, oh, like this all made sense? Or was there a degree of anger? Like, I can't believe we didn't catch this sooner. How much headache it could have saved me, how much heartache it could have saved me. Like, what was your reaction to get that diagnosis finally?
There's two sides for me. There's one that was, I'm not crazy. There's the name. This is something that has been researched, that people know about, that there's medication for, that there's specialists for. Like, there's this great relief on like my human side. On my side, that was, wait a second, you've always thought you're supposed to be in ministry. I've heard pastors talk about depression and anxiety from the stage. Never once in my life have I heard a pastor say that they're bipolar or anyone in ministry. And I was very much fed this Hollywood picture of bipolar, which is pretty dramatic, I would say, and not kind to bipolar people often. That was really damning because it was like, I was like questioning then, could I even be a mom, let alone could I be in ministry, and would I ever be trusted enough to be in ministry? And so I really struggled that year with going, Lord, I thought I heard your voice. I thought I discerned your plans for me. I thought you were calling me to ministry. Is this even a reality I can even step into now? And if I do step into it, is anyone else going to want to work with me?
The bipolar, is that something that was, because I'm not super duper educated on it, but was that something that would have been there regardless, despite the sexual assault? Or do you think that triggered it potentially? Because clearly there was a disruption that happened to your brain as a child. And do you think that could have like perhaps it was hereditary and passed down, but it was that event that then long term caused the depression and then perhaps some of the SSRIs made it worse? Like, as you're thinking back at it, like what do you think about that?
I don't know what the effects of trauma would be with it. I would think it's something, my sister also has diagnoses, and so I would think it's something that runs in our family, and that would have been there regardless. I do think the trauma and PTSD probably, that changes your triggers, and that can probably push you into manic episodes differently than if it wasn't there, if that makes sense.
And so how long did it take them to then fine-tune what worked for you in terms of a combination of therapy, medication? Like, how long was that process? Because not everybody gets that sorted out.
Yeah.
Like, that could take a while to figure out what works for you and what doesn't.
Well, I mean, I wrote about it, so I feel like I can be honest about it. It's 6 years, almost basically up until this year, because
Up until 2024?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was put on this medication. It worked great. Then I got pregnant, had a kid, got pregnant again, miscarried, got pregnant again. And pregnancy comes with all these hormones, and a lot of times they make you feel really, really good. And so I had gone years without any real struggle, and had a conversation with someone who I don't think was educated enough to speak into the reality of what it means to be bipolar, and was advised to get off of medication when I shouldn't have been advised to get off medication.
Was it a doctor? Or who was
a
this?
Therapist.
Whoa.
And so I was like, yeah, I've been on medication since I was 14. I don't know life without it. That sounds really nice, to experience life naturally. And again, got off the meds and did really, really well. Well, I was either pregnant or breastfeeding during that time. And so that contributed. And then all of a sudden there was this lull where I wasn't pregnant, I wasn't breastfeeding. and just out of nowhere got really, really bad. And it totally nosedived and ended up overdosing and back in the psych ward. And this time it was in the midst of, now I've been in ministry for years. I had been, at that point, it would be 5 years into vocational teaching. I was in the middle of writing my book, just going like, I remember getting into the psych ward going, there must be some sin issue in my life or something. I have to figure this out because I can't believe I ended up here again. And was like a hound dog in my own life after that for months, just digging like, what is this sin issue? What is this sin issue? Like, is it this? Is it this? And I have 2 different mentors. I've had one of them since I was 12. And then one of them started walking with me at the beginning of my mental health diagnosis. So for the past 6.5 years. And both of them very graciously were walking with me through that process, and just through getting more educated and talking with more therapists and with pastors and with my mentors, figuring out that being a bipolar person, going off medication is more harmful to my brain than you would think it would be. And that was really the catalyst of ending up back in the psych ward and overdosing on drugs. And so coming out of that experience after processing through that, going, okay, maybe I don't have the freedom to be off medication, but that's such a gift that the Lord has been able to use modern medicine and therapists and doctors and pastors and counselors that I could set up a frame for my life that I live with guardrails. So my thing for me is I'm always going to be on medication. I know that now. It might be the lowest dose possible, but I'm always going to be on medication now. I'm always going to be seeing a therapist. Maybe I go once a month instead of once a week, but I'm always going to be seeing a therapist. I don't go 1 month without meeting with one of my mentors and praying and walking through confession. Like, there's just these things that we've set up in my life now that one is edifying and good for me and challenging for me, but then it also allows me to live out what I believe God has called me into. Now, sometimes there's times where I don't get to live out my calling to Christ in the vocational sense, because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to be going out and doing public facing ministry when my life is chaotic in the inside and at home. And so there are seasons where I have to say no to things so that I can be above reproach. But this framework now that we've landed in has been such a gift, even though I think some people are like, man, you've really given up your freedom. I know there are a lot of people that feel very strongly that I'm pro medication. I want to say I'm pro medicating willy-nilly no matter what. Like, you have to figure out like what you're dealing with and like what medication works, and maybe someone needs deliverance ministry, right? That's something that always comes up in this conversation. Well, I promise you, I've sat with people, people have laid hands on me, I've walked through all the possible avenues, and for me, my brain doesn't produce the chemicals it needs to produce, and there's something awry, and that's part of the broken world that we live in. And the solution for that is multifaceted. It's not just medication, but medication is part of that.
Yeah, I am friendly with some of the folks in the deliverance community, and it's been refreshing to see them kind of change their tune on this and not just be like, everything's a demon.
Yeah.
Right? Bipolar's a demon. Everything's it's like, hold on a second. Like, there is a byproduct of the fall, and that some people's brain, unfortunately, is just going to function different. Sometimes it's a byproduct of trauma. Sometimes it's a byproduct of just hereditary and things in the fall. So it's interesting to see that community kind of come ways on that. But it's also, I mean, I just think about like what was life like for the bipolar person 100 years ago,
Mm,
120 years ago. That's not that long ago, right?
yeah.
And so now, I mean, wasn't it in like the 50s or 60s they were doing frontal lobotomies
Yeah.
on people with bipolar?
Mm.
One of the Kennedy daughters, I
Mm,
think they did a frontal lobotomy and it like wrecked her,
mm,
So you think about just how much things have improved. And I do think that there is a fascination and almost a romanticizing of mental health, especially like in the TikTok generation, some of the Zoomers, and sometimes a desire to overprescribe and like just get people on
yeah.
something. And that can be just as dangerous as
Mhm.
denying that people's brain chemistry works different.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting to hear you say all that, but I feel like there has been steps in the right direction. And even in the way you're talking about it, you're speaking about it with a sense of nuance, and that like, yeah, like some people may need deliverance and other people no, like their deliverance is they're saved and God's restored their soul, but God uses modern medicine to heal them and to help them flourish, So it's really cool to hear you talk about it in the way that you just shared right there. What would you say the biggest misconception is about people with bipolar?
That they can't, that there's this sense of like that there's not going to be a weight of responsibility, that they can't hold something down or like pursue something and walk it through. Or even if there is like a mental episode, like they're still going to come out of it. That's always the hope. And oftentimes that's what happens is like they make it out the other side and they can carry on with normal life and responsibilities. And it seems so basic, but it is. Hollywood has done Hollywood ruins everything, in my opinion. They've done so much damage to people who struggle with mental illness because they don't show like the redeeming factors of life.
What would you say was the biggest difference of you not on the medication with bipolar versus you on the medication? Because we've heard the guys like Kanye who he claims he was misdiagnosed. He started saying it wasn't bipolar, it was Asperger's, and all these interesting things that he said. But there was a specific for him. He was like, I gained weight. Maybe they put me on the stuff to make me gain weight, and then he said he felt like his creativity was zapped. And then he got off of it, and his whole life really started to take a nosedive, right?
Yeah.
So in your case, what would you say is the on medication versus not on medication? What was the biggest contrast?
Yeah, when I was off medication this last time, the nosedive that I took was so sharp and so fast. It was like within 1 week, I went from being fine to overdosing on drugs. And that is like, even now when I look back on it, I'm like, that was insane how fast your brain just malfunctions when you don't have what you need. Whereas now the medication that I'm on is a mood stabilizer, and so I don't hit like manic peaks hard. And with that, it's actually people who know me in my day-to-day life, people I'm in community with. I remember I was talking to a very close friend of mine saying, I think my meds made me type A. I've never been type A before. And she said, no, Brena, I think you've always been type A. I think that the medication has just like kind of given you this freedom. It's calmed down the chaos. And so like I would always chase these euphoric feelings. And that was hard as someone who travels to speak, because when you travel, you get those euphoric feelings. And then when I'd come home, I'd crash really hard. And so I had this perception in my mind that my life's only good when I'm doing these things. And then in home, life is really, really hard. Well, that's like terrible. And that's really sad, especially when you're a stay-at-home mom. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, my life is ordered. I get up, I make food for my kids, I work out every day, I do laundry every day. Like these things that I never did, that I never thought I was capable of doing. it's always been there. I just needed the help to reorder the things in my brain. And so all of a sudden now I'm living this life that my mundane is still extremely life-giving because it's not chaotic anymore. It's not like I'm trying to not drown. All of a sudden it's like I can swim laps and I actually enjoy it.
I found that there's often freedom in the mundane, that there's freedom in the routine, there's freedom in the consistency of waking up and like, I'm going to go on a walk and like, boom, I got a W. Boom, come home. I'm there when my kids are awake. Okay, boom, I like being there when my kids are awake. Just got a W. Okay, now I'm going to have breakfast with my family. Boom, that's another W. So it's like you're stacking W's the whole morning. And I think sometimes we underestimate like the compounding effect of the mundane. And you spread it out over the course of years or decades, like going through Genesis with my son every single night. Like that's a consistent momentum that I'm building that I may not see the fruit of that stuff until later, right? So I think creative people who are highly ambitious tend to take a low view of the mundane and the routine. But I've come to just realize that there's so much beauty in the consistency and the compounding effect that is actually liberating. And then if I have these like, oh, you know, Tuesday I'm booking a flight to go to New York on Thursday, and then I go, no, like, this disruption in my routine. I don't like it. Like so like I'm kind of the opposite. Like I've become the opposite. I enjoy the routine and the mundane. So it's interesting to hear you like echo some of that and almost like verbatim in terms of how I felt and just conversations me and my wife have been having about those day-to-day commitments being really healthy for people, even if they don't have bipolar, just doing the same thing every day is helpful. And then you mix it up and you go on vacation and you go take a trip or you go get away, right? So that's really cool. Okay, let me hit pause on this. So the power in the mundane, the consistency, all these different things. You said you've always desired to be a mother. And then God opens this door for you to become a mother and to be a wife, and not necessarily the way you expected, but it sounds like you're super pumped and content in the season that you're in. Did you, as someone that's clearly gifted, articulate, has a passion for theology, passion for ministry, did you ever see yourself in this season of being a stay-at-home mom that also has this entrepreneurial side to you, right? Because I think that's something that like it's tricky for women that are driven and how to navigate that, even with the Harrison situation that came out, right? And it's like this delicate balance. And so like, did you see yourself, you grew up playing sports, right? Did you see yourself like, okay, boom, at this season in your life, you're like a stay-at-home mom who also has a publishing deal and has a book and has a public speaking platform, but you have to have these guardrails. Like, did you see yourself in this season?
No, never. I remember, so I got pregnant, and I got pregnant my second. I had decided to go back to school because I was teaching youth in interim ministry, and then I felt like after I got diagnosed, found out I was pregnant, I need to give something up, and it was like, okay, I'm going to be a mom. So it's either giving up school or it's giving up ministry, at least in this aspect. And I really felt like the Lord was like, okay, step down from interim youth ministry. And I thought, this makes no sense because I've spent the last, 2 years of my life getting words from people who are saying, you're going to speak, you're going to be in ministry, which I've always been leery about. My faith is never in the word. My faith's in God. And like, it's not a promise to have a platform. It's not a promise to be a speaker. Like those aren't those things. But it was interesting to me that I kept getting words from people that were the same and just going, okay, like what I have peace in is stepping down from ministry. And so I stepped down from ministry. I have 2 years of school to graduate. I do the full 2 years, and in those 2 years realize, oh crap, I love theology. I love writing. Like, I just fell in love with this work and these asking hard questions. And I didn't know how I was going to enter back into ministry, but it was really interesting because I was super frustrated with the church going, okay, I have all these friends on the outside of the doors of the church saying, does God care about sexuality? Does God care about abortion? Does God care about weed? Does God care about all these things? And inside the church, it was like, we can't talk about that. It's too taboo. We're not going to mention that. That makes people too uncomfortable. Only men struggle with porn. Women don't struggle with porn, but maybe they do, but we're not going to talk about it from the platform. Just like all these things. I was like, but my friends have questions about this. And if they don't hear it from the church, they're going to hear it from the world. And I remember my professor spoke so well to it, but the pastors weren't. And I remember just like complaining to my husband and complaining to God, and both my husband and felt like the Lord said, dude, you have a voice. Why don't you ask these questions? And I was like, I didn't have a platform at that point in time. Like, didn't know what to do. And my husband was like, just start a podcast. It's easy to do. The equipment is cheap. I'll give you the stuff. And started this podcast really with the expectation that maybe 10 people would listen. And it was like it started off as a really bitter, like, kind of punch towards my own community, saying like, well, you're not asking the question, so I'll do it. And it was like the wrong attitude to have. But then within the space of a year, it just kind of blew up. And all of a sudden I was getting messages from people saying I left the church because I felt shamed that I had questions about these things. But now you're talking about it. And even though I don't identify as a Christian, it's made me interested in Jesus again because a Christian is talking about it.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, all I know is that I'm called to speak about what God has done in my life and to speak to the people on the fringes. And I don't know what that looks like, but I'm going to keep leaning into this. And from the podcast, I started getting invited to teach, and I'd finally graduated and felt a little bit more equipped to be teaching authoritatively of the context of the Bible, because that's what I care about is orthodoxy. You know, we can approach these difficult questions and these taboo questions, but we have to do it through biblical orthodoxy because that is the authority. And just found this world finally open up of people saying, we need to talk about this. We need to hear about this. We need to hear about it through a biblical lens. And finding God really giving me the gift saying, okay, you're going to be home with your kids Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And then at night, you're going to be staying up late and writing this book. And on weekends, you're going to be gone maybe a few months a week speaking. But I'm going to allow you to do both. And I just never thought, there's no aspect of life that I'm living right now that I ever dreamed that I'd be living.
And your husband seems really supportive of obviously the podcast. He's giving you the idea for that. You said you don't travel more than approximately 8 times a year. Well, thank you for making one of those 8 to be with me here. That's awesome. So was there anything that felt different after you had kids in terms of your own desires as a mom, right? And then I asked this because obviously the controversy that happened with the Kansas City Chiefs football player, but I've even looked at like the data. Gallup does this poll, and they surveyed working women with kids under 18, and they found out that 56% of working women with kids under 18 would have preferred to stay home and be moms had they been given the opportunity to, which is that's the majority.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about Christians, we're not talking about trad cons, we're not talking about Catholics, we're not talking about conservatives, we're just women. And so I've always found that interesting that that's where the majority are. But then you look at Proverbs 31, and I would argue that the Proverbs 31 woman is in a different season of her life. Like she probably doesn't have kids in diapers, but she's building up something as she's going and building this life. And so it's this interesting tapestry of like this tension that's being held across scripture and across society and across culture. and people were like re-engaging in these conversations of whatever, like, gender roles or whatever you want to call it, but there's something happening where people are like engaging in terms of these conversations. So like, how personally would you say that having kids changed anything for you in terms of desiring to like be at home more?
It changed two things. I think first it changed the way that I pay attention to convictions. I was telling someone the other day, it was like a month and a half ago, I got offered this dream job that I think anyone in their right mind would have absolutely said yes to, and that was my desire. And I had been offered two similar jobs before that in different areas, and I said no pretty quickly to both of them, and the conviction was that this next year, my youngest is 3, and I felt convicted to be home with him one more year. And so it was an easy no to those first two, and this third job came up, and I was like, Austin, we got to pray about this. Like, I would love to do this. And he said, okay. And the next morning I got up and I went on a walk, and I just remembered feeling like the Lord said, Brena, why'd you say no to the other 2 jobs? Well, this conviction. Okay, so where's the conviction now? Well, I don't feel it now. But is the conviction still there? It's like marriage. You don't always feel in love, but it's the choice that you're called to make. So I feel a stronger responsibility to pay attention to the convictions that God has given me. And my conviction in this season of life is that when my kids are home, I am also home. But at the same time, I have this other conviction to be wildly transparent with my kids. When I got to the airport to come here, my 5-year-old started sobbing. Mom, why do you have to go? And I was like, Rudy, do you remember what I get to do? Wipes his tears. Yeah, Mom, you get to tell people about Jesus. Is that important? Well, yeah, Jesus gives people hope. Like having these kind of small conversations about what I do. And him, I think it's important for him to see that Austin and I both have jobs outside of the home. And that Austin and I both are called to take care of our kids as well. You know, my husband, I'm very blessed in that my husband works a job that when I'm gone, he gets to be home. So often our kids aren't left with people who aren't their parents. And so I think there's been this balance of living out the conviction that I feel called to teach within the margins that God has given me, and then having very healthy boundaries around those things.
That is so cool. Next time, maybe you can bring the kids and come to Southern California. I was the same way when I just went to New York. It was like, I'm in and out. Like I don't like being gone for an extended number of time. And then if I can, I try to take my family to do stuff with me. Me and my son do an annual Father's Day trip every year. And then like when I got like a conference coming up around my wife's birthday, so we're gonna take the whole family for that and make it like a trip. And so we try to do as much stuff as we can together. But that's really awesome to hear you articulate it in that way. And I think there's a freedom there that people want to put people in boxes. You're either this or you're this. And it's like, well, life is more fluid than that. And anyone who has kids will say like, having kids is one of the coolest things ever, right? Now, I would guess that it's probably different for a mom than a dad, right? Like there's differences that we have. But generally speaking, like no one's like pumped to be away from their children, right? Like most of us want to be home and be around. So that's really cool. So the book, give me the heart behind the book. Because I mean, we've been talking about a lot of this, and I think ultimately like leaning into suffering as a Christian and that God being there in the middle of it. But I think what you're sharing, I mean, I just think you're giving, in this conversation alone, so much voice to so many different people. People who deal with same-sex attraction, people who deal with mental health stuff, people who, women who are desiring to be moms, but have something that they want to share with the world, right? Whether it's their testimony or whether it's a business they want to start. Like, I think you're speaking into so many different aspects. So give me a bit more of the heart behind the book.
Yeah, so when I look at the world, especially that I grew up on, I'm on the young end of the millennial generation. I've always watched people look at suffering, questions, and doubts and say, because of these things, because I hold these things, they have served as an off-ramp to my faith. When I look at my own story and then I open up the Bible to read through the narrative of countless people in that book, I go, wait a second. If we lean into questions, suffering, and doubt, and we lean into them well, they can actually serve to unveil the character of God even more for us. And that they become an instrument and a tool and something deeply beautiful, still hard, still real, still difficult, but something beautiful that serves our relationship with Christ. It doesn't have to be an off-ramp to faith. And so I see the legalistic world of church often saying, no, don't say that. You can't. They kind of shame Christians into submission that suffer or that are struggling. And then I see the progressive world say, toss it out the window, toss your faith, leave it all. And I'm going, well, when I read through the Bible and what I have experienced personally of Christ is he's somewhere in between, saying, I'm not telling you to be quiet. I'm actually inviting you to bring all these things to me, to voice them out loud. But then instead of voicing them and storming off, why don't you voice them and then allow me to answer? Mm-hmm. What do I have to say to suffering, questions, and doubts? And so that's why I ended up writing the book's called Can I Say That? How Unsafe Questions Lead Us to the Real God. And it's really, it's parts of my own story, but also parts of the biblical narrative that I have seen display this picture of Christ that is saying, man, these heavy things that you carry can be used for good.
What would you say is the biggest, a personal, you said unsafe question? What would you say the personal biggest, like unsafe question that you had, and what was the answer that you felt like you got on the other side of all of this?
You know, I think for a long time it was, do I have to be made straight? What would it look like, especially now in a world where we talked about at the beginning, where it's like, don't make this your identity, don't let it be known. How does that work? You know, how does my attractions and temptations work and play into my faith life? And then now specifically, it is my ongoing mental health issues and a lot of shame that goes with that. And it's not necessarily that that's been answered. Like, there's not a clear-cut answer for that, and I think some people hate that. Or we live in a world where it's like, if you're going to talk about suffering as a Christian, like, we can't say that hope and suffering coexist. But when I look at the Gospels, I'm like, that's the picture that I get. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome it. Like, the both and. That God is looking at us in our suffering saying, not only like have I overcome the world, but also I walk with you in this suffering. So it's not necessarily an answer, but it's the truth in that when I say I am never alone, that's true. But I'm also never alone in suffering. It's not that I never face suffering or never walk through suffering. It's that in my suffering, I am not closed off. I am with my Father who knows me and loves me and cares for me and sees me more clearly than any other person in this world. And that with Christ, it's going to sound so cliche and cheesy, but we are more than conquerors. And it's not like us becoming more than conquerors. It's Christ conquering for us and carrying us through to that.
What would you say was the bigger aspect of suffering in your life? Was it the dealing with same-sex attraction, or would you say it was the mental health bipolar aspect?
I think it was both of them at different points in time, because before I was married, you have that aspect of these longings that you don't think will ever be met. And like that's, it's like before you ever have sex, you're like obsessed with sex. And then you have sex and you're like, oh, this is good, but also it's not everything. So there's like my sexuality, that part of my life was so all encompassing in my teens and early 20s. And now I think I do look at the rest of my life and go, oh Lord, how are you going to keep me from myself in my lowest moments? Because, one of the most terrifying moments of my life was when I overdosed. I thought I was just going to like pass out. And then if I were to wake up again, I thought I would wake up in the hospital or wake up in the ambulance. But it's like everything stopped working except my hearing. And I think the Lord did that on purpose. Because as I'm sitting there hearing my husband on the phone with 911, I'm just like sitting there going like, yep, this is it. I'm dying and I'm ready to be dead. And then all of a sudden I hear my husband say to my son, buddy, Mom needs help right now. And some firefighters are going to come in. You don't need to be scared. It's going to be okay. And at that moment, I realized I had messed up. Like that was the hardest moment I've ever experienced to this day. And so now when I'm doing well, I'm not so naive to think that I could never get to that place again, because it's a reality. I've been in that place twice now as an adult. So now I think the hard part is for me to sit here and go like, Lord, my desire is to never be in that place again. At the same time, the Lord has wildly saved me from myself in those places. And so I think it's just walking and trying to discern again, like, how do I keep myself from getting there again with the Lord's help, but also understanding that when you are in the dark night of the soul, that's some language that's used to describe this, that the Lord there's like this painting, I think it's like somewhat famous, of this guy who's just like collapsed and like the Lord is carrying him, just like trying to trust that would be me and the Lord. Yeah.
Wow. You said that all your senses were shut down except you could hear. And it made me think of, they did a documentary on people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, and everyone who survived said the moment they jumped, they regretted it. And that has to be a scary place to like, oh shoot, I messed up. I didn't really want to do this. What would you have to say to people who are perhaps dealing with suicide ideation now, that are perhaps thinking about these things now, and they can't fathom life on the other side of those feelings? And what word would you have for them?
If you can will yourself to say it out loud. It feels like the scariest thing in the world to ever tell someone, especially I think if you're a Christian or if you're a person in ministry. Like it feels like there's so much shame in identifying like, I want to be dead. But the minute you say it out loud, it's like one of the things I learned the second time in the psych ward is when you don't speak things out loud, those emotions grow. They did a study on that of people watching scary movies and people who could talk out loud and people who couldn't talk about their feelings, and how much that grew. And the week leading up to my hospitalization, how my headphones were on my head 8 hours a day. I wasn't talking to anyone, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And even now, having one of those parameters being for my life, that I just, when I identify in my head something that I'm feeling, that I say it out loud to my husband or to my mentor as soon as possible. So if you can will yourself to just say it out loud to one safe person. And then I think, like, no, the Lord already sees you in that place. Like, there's nothing we can hide from the Lord, and there's nothing we should hide from the Lord. And this picture of a God who is abounding and steadfast in love, who's like with you in your suffering. Like, I think that is if I can say anything to anyone in that place, it's not, God is not up above you while you are in the pit saying like, come on, just reach out your hand. Like, I think that's always the picture we get, right? Where it's like God's throwing down the rope or he's throwing down the ladder. No, he's in the pit with you. He's next to you. Do you understand that? That there's no like shame we can have in the presence of the Lord, because that is not his heart. That is not his character. It's factually untrue that there's no shame that we can have. Like, it doesn't exist in, like, the Lord doesn't look at you in shame. And so just this recognition of identifying where you're at and then saying, Lord, show me how you are with me here now. And trusting that the Lord's not trying to rush you out of this pit, but that he is with you in it.
It sounds like a lot of this stuff is still relatively fresh for you, right? What do you think long term, or what do you hope like restoration and wholeness looks like for you? Is this one of those thorn in my flesh? I'm going to walk with this until I see glory, or do you have people experienced, like, what do you make of that, and like what is healing and wholeness look like on this side of eternity?
You know, it's funny. I saw someone at church a few months ago, and she said, Brena, I always pray for your healing. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have neglected praying for healing for myself. And I am someone who, again, I'm very pro medication. I'm very pro, like, I don't think remission, if you read through some of the things I've written, I would say I don't think remission is a term that should be used around mental illness, because it's not often the reality. I don't know why God doesn't often choose to heal people, but at the same time, we have a God who heals. And oftentimes it's like, ask, knock, seek, right? These things where it's like, oh man, I haven't done that. And so I'm trying to sit in this place of going, I can be eager and I can ask for healing, and I should. But also, because I have been saved, healing is coming. That's the truth. Healing is coming. If you know the Lord, healing is coming. It might not be on this side of heaven, but it will be a reality for you. And so living as if that is my testimony, I think I don't do that as much as I should when I'm talking to people, especially in the secular world. Man, you get in that psych ward and faith conversations become really interesting. And just remembering, going, wait a second, I actually do have a hope in that I will be healed. Yeah. And so trying to live out the balance of checking these boxes of mundane, of am I physically active? Am I eating well? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I taking my medication? Am I seeing my therapist? Am I meeting with my mentors? Am I in biblical community? Am I participating in confession? Like all these things, right? The book of James. Church, I feel like we ignore the book of James. We need to not. Going through this list, and then also going, and Lord, I believe that you can heal me. Help me in my disbelief.
You referenced the book of James, you referenced confession, biblical community, active, sleep, sunshine, right? All these things. Do you think, like, is it the chicken or the egg? Like, is there the aspect of people that need to make a practice of their faith, right? Or do you think sometimes it's you need the jump start of perhaps medication to get into the practice of faith, right? Or building out that margin in your life to say, hey, I can go outside, exercise, eat well, sleep well, have access to community, therapists, confession, right? And in your case, you're saying medication. Like, which comes first? Like, is it sometimes some people just need that boost of the medication to do the other things? Or is it the other things that got you to like seek treatment, right? Because I think in my case, I have onset PTSD, but in my case, it was all the other things that just kind of kept compounding, and I just kind of kept feeling better. And then before I knew it, the flare-ups wouldn't be as bad, and the triggers wouldn't be as bad. And as long as I stay on touching grass, going outside, exercising, sleep, food, time with family, I'm fairly functional and healthy. But that's not the case for everybody. But I wonder which came first. Like, was it the desire to go to the gym and get acclimated with my health and eating, or was it the fact that I had the luxury to do it and that just, like just compounded? I always wonder that for different people. So like in your case, which came first? Was it the physical, natural treatment, the byproduct of you getting professional mental health treatment, or are they end both? What do you think about that?
I think this last time for me specifically, I needed the medication in order to calm the chaos and then step into those regular practices. Because before, my brain was just so messed up that I couldn't fathom. Like, this stepping into those practices seemed so overwhelming. But I think if we're speaking in general, we have to split the difference and say, if you are in biblical community and you are living out biblical confession, that means people are going to be able to speak into your life. And I always say you need people in your life that love you but love God more.
That's good.
So that you trust, so that they can help identify what those things are. Because there are going to be some people who need the meds first, and then there are going to be other people who are like, hey, actually, you, to speak really frankly, you eat really crappy and you sleep like crap, so you feel like crap. But if you're not allowing outside voices to peer into your real life, not the life you're trying to make people believe you're living, but your actual life, if you don't have people admonishing you and calling you to these things, you're going to live out this false perception that you might genuinely believe is just your life. And so I think that's the really important part, is biblical community that is honest to you and you're honest to them. There's that two-way street.
And can challenge you sometimes. Yes. Yeah. I would say I was more in the latter category in terms of my own mental health journey, of just kind of needing somebody to point out, like, bro, like, what are you doing? You're up until 3, 4 in the morning. Like, you're eating terrible. We used to make these, oh gosh, this is so embarrassing. There's a 24-hour donut place around here called Peterson's Donut Corner in Escondido. And Zach will attest that, like, 2017, 2018, we would hit that donut midnight, 11, and just wilding out, like, what am I doing? Like, what am I putting in my body? And it wasn't helping at all. It was making everything worse. And then once I kind of got the physical aspect in order, it's like everything kind of fell in line more. So I love how you describe that I think there's both. This is perhaps an oddball question, but do you think there's any aspect to this that is perhaps the downstream effects of some of our Protestant views not having enough of a robust practice of our faith?
Oh, yeah.
Like, we're kind of like, if you're a Protestant, especially if you're evangelical or fundamentalist, like, you like Bible, prayer, church, that's your faith.
Yeah.
But you're really talking about a holistic approach, right? And I feel like when I talk to my Eastern Orthodox friends, they're like, yeah, Wednesdays, Fridays, we fast. They're basically like vegetarians on Wednesdays and Fridays. Or they have confession. They do these things and they have sacraments and they have these like very serious practices. And sometimes we don't have that in evangelical or fundamentalist type streams. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think with Protestantism, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's interesting, I work with youth a lot, and I'll talk about confession, and the question is always, well, isn't it enough for me to confess to God? Why do I have to confess to other people?
Yeah.
It's like, no, the Lord has the example of the Trinity being in community for us is for so much more than what we think.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much protection in that confession aspect of community and living out loud. And I think the non-denominational churches or the evangelical church has gone, okay, this is not a saying of my own. I heard this from John Tyson, I think 2 years ago. I was at a conference and he said, we're so afraid of being pegged as legalistic that we dare not disciple people.
Say that one more time. That's
right?
a bar.
We're so afraid of being legalistic that we dare not disciple people.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that is so our issue in the Western church right now, that it's like, like I think about divorce and I'm like, I think people are like, oh, we're getting divorced. And we're like, oh man, how can we be there for you? Instead of going like, wait,
Mm-hmm.
before you sign those papers.
Mm-hmm.
We need to meet, and we need to meet several times, and we need to pray. And there needs to be conversations that are being held, but we're afraid that we're going to be seen as too legalistic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, we've been allowed to be lukewarm in our faith circles. And it's like, we're just so consumeristic in the Western world that is how church has become. And it's like, maybe some aspect, if not a lot of our suffering is actually due to the fact that we're unwilling to step into spiritual practices.
That's good. Wow. Okay. Last question. There's going to be people that watch this. They're going to be triggered by your loose affiliation with the Side B community, and they're going to instantly jump to the guilty by association fallacy. Hey, like I know you hold to this, but did you hear about these people making friendship covenants and two same-sex attracted men all of a sudden do a covenant, they move in together, and they'll like reference some random thing that I personally am not super familiar with. Or they'll say this is a slippery slope, or they say, why would you say it's okay for people to identify as this, right? I would say that they're more, in my opinion, more on the fundamentalist, legalist side. But sometimes they don't do a great job of accurately representing people. And like, what would some of your thoughts be to that community that's like any reference of being same-sex attracted, they would say, oh, those are just disordered desires and you shouldn't even say that. There was one person specifically that flat out said, like, if you are dealing with same-sex attracted desires or gay, go back in the closet, right? What would be some of your response to that community, which I'm sure is going to see some of our conversation and try to tear it apart?
Yeah, there's no aspect of the character of God that's like, you're struggling with that, go back and struggle with it alone. So I rebuke that. There is no part of Christ that says, yeah, go do that alone. Christ says, bring it to me. And for some people, it's I have found that the majority of people who desire to name their temptations is an attempt to just let you know their experience. I'm not trying to say that this is my identity, that this is what I'm choosing, but what I want you to know, especially in the church world, so many conversations revolve around marriage, which is so unfair. And when you're being asked all the time, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Oh, that question, like when I'm thinking about, some of my guy friends who are gay, it's like, man, for them to be able to just like explain in I'm a gay Christian in one simple sentence, to share like, I have had deep theological wrestling and struggling and anguish for years of my life that I've walked through with the Lord, and I've come to, and when you say conclusion, it's like maybe not even the conclusion, but like in this season of life, dating a woman isn't an option for me because I struggle. Like, for us to damn people because of that is so Christ-like. It just totally misses the character of God to me. That it's like we have to figure out, I think you got to ask yourself, what are you scared of? Are you scared that it is a slippery slope? Well, if you're scared that it's a slippery slope, find someone who identifies that way and ask them questions. Ask them about their accountability. I'm sure people want to share. You know, we gotta identify the roots of these things that are coming out as bad fruit. And we live in a place where it's like, instead of asking questions, we make accusations. That's all the internet is making accusations. And it's like, that's why I love Preston Sprinkle so much, is because he's creating this culture of Christians who can listen compassionately and engage thoughtfully and critically, but also hear people out and hear their stories, because that changes things. We don't understand the nuance of someone's life and their circumstances and even just syntax until we sit with that. And so I think is there a bias or something in my life that is making me so angry about the way this person said this or did this or is doing this, that it's actually a root in my life that I need to identify, that the Lord wants to walk with me through.
I think what's most interesting about that is even attending that event and hearing the four different perspectives that day, even if I may not agree with someone labeling themselves a gay Christian or whatever they want to, like whatever the label is, I think the practical wisdom of like, people do deal with this, so we can get into the semantics of it and who should and shouldn't be. Will this person ever get married and be in a heterosexual marriage? Will they not? Will they forever identify? Should they put the word gay before Christian, or should they say it right? I think regardless on my personal opinions on that, which I don't think matter as much, I think the practical takeaway I got was, I, as a married man, it'll be 16 years, me and my wife have been married together 20 years, need to be more intentional to be engaged with the single people in my church and not just kind of do my own thing and do my own life. And so I walked away from that conference like, oh man, that was convicting. Like that was convicting, and that like I need to lean in. Not that like I'm looking at dudes in the church that are maybe same-sex attracted. I'm like, I want to be your mentor, right? It wasn't like that. It was just like, man, there's folks in the church that can really benefit from having access and relationship and coming over and doing the mundane things with me. So I left that conference really intentionally leaning into a couple relationships of folks that are in our young adults ministry that I've had the privilege of speaking at, that I just kind of want to be more present with them and not like come over for dinner so we do this fancy thing. Just like come over and hang out, you know? And that was like a really practical takeaway. And as well as myself knowing that I also need people that are a season or two ahead of me, right? So people that perhaps have grandkids, you know, and the value in that. And I think that's the beautiful like aspect of community and confession that sometimes is missing in many of our church streams. So I think when I heard the backlash to the conference before the conference even happened, when I had people reaching out to me and like, hey, be careful. Like, what are you talking about? Like, be careful with Preston. I'm like, what? And like, he's going to come out as affirming. Like, no, he's not. Like, and even in hearing him after you guys all shared, and then the panel, I think he comes out and goes, this is not a secondary issue, which is like a very firm position. And I just think so much of the critique is not fair. I think it lumps everyone in who's quote unquote side B as in like one monolith, and they're not, right? Like you're not the same as some of the other people on that panel. You even your language, like to what you choose to use to describe yourself, is not the same as everyone else on that panel. So that was like disappointing to me in terms of how some Christian circles reacted to it, you know. And so hopefully the conversation we had here gave better context. And I think your book, it is going to do that as well. And I think it'll take people into just a, like, hey, regardless on your disagreement on language and what isn't and isn't from God, and can someone deal with this? And at the very least, let's do life with people we disagree with.
Yeah, I want
You
to
know?
say one thing to that, if I can.
Yeah.
The church has always been a diverse body of believers. And what I love is whenever I talk about sexuality, people are always like 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, right? That's the sexually immoral will not go to heaven, right? That list. There's a list. But what people fail to miss is Paul is penning this letter to the Corinthians, a church that he loves.
Yep.
And at the end of that section, he goes, as some of you once were. And what that means in reality is he's looking at this church, thinking of them as he's writing to them, going, I remember you. You were a temple prostitute, and now you love the Lord, and you're a part of our church. I remember you. You were in a gay relationship with this man, which did exist back then. People, do your history. And he's like, and you left that, and now you are now that person's probably living single in the church. Like this is the reality of what the church has always been, a redeemed people. And for us to remember that the body is a diverse group of people that God has called away from our fleshly desires to himself.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, even in the Church of Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 3, he calls them worldly. In 1 Corinthians 5, he addresses that there's sexual immorality in the church such that the pagans don't even do. And then he says in 1 Corinthians 6, as some of you were. And I want to say in 2 Corinthians, he has to readdress the sexual immorality thing. So that even in the Church of Corinth, this wasn't this like static, all these people were sexually immoral. No, none of these people were sexually immoral. Like, no, they were still wrestling and fighting and waging war on the flesh and sorting through these things. And so I think the Church of Corinth is a great parallel to America today.
Yeah.
And the issues that people are having. And I think just giving more voice to people's struggles and people's suffering, I think is very brave of you. And I appreciate you. And I appreciate you writing this book and just not being afraid to lean into these hard conversations.
Thank you.
Where can they pre-order the book, which just launched?
Yeah, you can get the book wherever books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target.
You have a website of your own as well that will
Yeah,
link
you
below?
can go to www.brenablaine.com if you are like, hey, my church needs to hear this message, or we have a conference and we'd love to speak to the intersection of suffering and faith. I'd love to partner with you.
Very cool. All right, guys, we're out of here. Make sure you guys check out the brand new book, brenablaine.com. Peace.